Hello and welcome to Nerdverse Unshuffled, a geeky podcast where we introduce you to the language of board games. We are your hosts, Jacques and Fayyaad and Fayyaad Hendricks.
Tiny little bit. Okay, so in this episode, we wanted to talk about one of the most important jargon terms you need to know: board game mechanics. Why did we pick this as the first topic for our episodes? Well, there is no real way to talk about board games without talking about mechanics. It's also one of the most daunting parts of getting into board games, because there are many, they can get super complicated, and some are very confusing. Looking at it from a technical perspective, it can get more tricky and more confusing. But that's the point of this podcast. We want to clarify things and make it easier to understand and less intimidating. Fortunately, once we've explained what board game mechanics are and how they help you, it should be a lot easier to be a part of the conversation.
Absolutely, yes.
So
fully agree.
Just a quick disclaimer, it's almost impossible to talk about mechanics without discussing specific examples. Do not fear. You can find definitions and descriptions of any jargon terms we might use over on the site in a series of articles titled Board Game Jargon Primer. So yeah, I mean, specific mechanics will also get their own episodes of the podcast. So check out nerdverse.co.za and subscribe to the podcast to get notified about future episodes where we'll be looking at these various mechanics in depth. But now, on with the show. So we're going to start with a little light reading, as we do with every episode. So we'll start with a definition from the board game article. So take it away, Fayyaad.
Board game mechanics, it's the dice that we roll. It's the pawns that we move. It's the cards that we play. It's the hand of cards that we're holding. It's the way we manipulate the cards in our hands. It's the way we play a card and say, aha, take that. It's the little men in Risk moving from country to country. It's the ladders in Snakes and Ladders. It's the snakes in Snakes and Ladders. It's all of those things are at the heart mechanics, and it's what makes the game move. I mean, Risk would not be Risk without those little men and without the dice and without the armies. Snakes and Ladders would not be Snakes and Ladders without the dice, without the snakes and without the ladders. Or they've changed it in some countries to slides instead of snakes. And, chess would not be chess without the forward movement of the pieces on the board.
Yeah.
And this is what makes a mechanic. It's how the player interacts with the pieces on the board.
There's a lot there to unpack. So let's just look at that in a little bit of detail quickly. First of all, is it a mechanic or a mechanism, or are both kind of okay?
So both terms have been used interchangeably in the board game discourse online. So some places call it mechanic, some places call it a mechanism. And because it's been used both one way or the other, they get conflated with each other. They both valid. They mean the same thing.
Mm.
They both refer to the same concepts.
Yeah. And I mean, it does depend how pedantic we want to get about which is the grammatically correct one. The bottom line is, if you go looking for information about the kind of things that we're going to be talking about on this episode, you'll either find it under mechanics or mechanism. Don't get too hung up on that distinction. Generally, that's what people are meaning the same thing when they use those two terms. So what is a board game mechanic at its heart?
As we said before, it's the systems of the game that make the game go. It's the actions and the rules and how players interact with the different components in specific ways.
Mm.
So mechanics is basically, it's all the moving parts that make the board game a board game.
And I mean, just looking at that definition, basically the history of board game mechanics is in a lot of ways the history of board games.
No, absolutely.
So,
no, you're quite right.
I mean, we've come from very specific, very limited set of sort of starter mechanics, or very sort of fundamental things that kind of we've seen iterated in various game genres and games over the decades and centuries, in fact.
No, you're quite right. Some of the earliest mechanics to ever appear in games we are still using today. So dice rolling and movement on a board, for example, the earliest games that were created that we have found through archaeological digs, and we're still using them. It's fantastic. So, I mean, the earliest known board game that we know of is called Senet. We've got incomplete rules. We don't know exactly how it worked, but we've got some inkling of how things might have worked. But the earliest known game with a complete rule set that we know of is called the Royal Game of Forgive my butchering of any Nordic languages, but Nefertafl is an old Viking game. It's about 1,000 years old. On top of that, you've got the Mancala family of games from Africa. So those are some of the oldest games that date from around, 3 Common Era, 3 CE?
Yeah.
So the worst part about some of these games is that, we are so far and so close to them at the same time.
Yes.
So give an example of, Senet. I mean, that's an ancient game. That game is lost to the muddy mists of time.
Yeah.
But Nefertafl was being played until very recently, relatively speaking. And we don't know the rules. Nobody bothered to write it down because it was assumed that everybody knows how to play this game.
Yeah.
It's frustrating.
It's like, why would you write down the rules for chess?
In the day and age where passing things down through oral tradition was the way of passing knowledge, it makes sense that, the knowledge was not written down. But still, it could have been. Someone at some point could have carved it into a stone tablet somewhere.
Yeah,
I blame the scribes.
It is a bit frustrating to know that these ancient games existed and they're kind of inaccessible to us. You can try to reconstruct what those rules might have been based on what we know about board games now, but it's such a there's this tantalizing idea that maybe there's this really cool mechanic that someone like a Viking 1,000 years ago came up with this really magnificent mechanic, and now it's like lost to time.
Absolutely.
We did do some research before the episode, and we were trying to find out which were the newest mechanics. That was a lot more difficult than we anticipated for various reasons, but we did find a couple of things that look newer. One of them was Legacy. It's a whole genre of games that have become quite popular. That beats deck building by a scant 3 years. And action retrieval is another one that looks like a pretty recent mechanic, around 2014.
That's a lot more recent than I expected when I looked into it.
But I mean, we're not going into that too much. I mean, those are just examples. And again, don't get too hung up on what those mechanics mean. If you're not familiar with them, we'll get there, but it's a long list. There are many. They seem to be growing at a rate of not. Do we want to quickly just go through some mechanics?
Yeah, I mean, some mechanics, they come in and out of favor as people rediscover old ones and find new ways of putting them together. Once per game abilities, for example, were first used in 1938, but it didn't really become, heavily popular until 1998, so that's a good 60 years later with Samurai, and then Battlestar Galactica, the board game, in 2008, so another 10 years after that. Playing cards, probably invented by the Chinese in the Tang Dynasty around the 9th century. It's a long time ago, but the introduction of paper and the introduction of woodblock printing helped create the first modern playing cards, if you want to call it the 9th century modern. We spoke about the Royal Game of That's a 2-player strategy race game. It was first played back in ancient Mesopotamia. It's, that sort of thing, it comes and goes.
Yeah.
It was, was popular across the entire Middle Eastern area. So a lot of people were playing it. It went always as far as Crete and Sri Lanka, it's a far stretch for a time that didn't have modern distribution shipping channels. That's quite a good reach.
Yeah.
So, I mean, one copy of is held by the British Museum, dated back to 2600 BC, 2500 BC. So that makes it possibly one of the oldest game boards in the world.
Yeah.
right?
So do we have the rules for
We do have rules for
Okay.
because someone actually did write these down.
Excellent.
So whether
Okay.
with the complete or and definitive rules is a whole nother story, because as games change space, people innovate and change rules. And we can talk about that when we get to Mancala. And we've got a whole episode on Mancala coming up at some point. Senate as well, we don't have rules for Senate. And that dates back to also 2600 BC. You know, the rules have disappeared. We don't know. So we can look at the game and, like you said, we can surmise what the rules might have been, and we can play it. And apparently it's still quite a lot of fun to play.
Okay.
But it's still conjecture about what the actual rules were.
Yeah.
And chess, when everyone knows chess.
Yes.
It's also called Western chess, international chess, because it turns out there are an entire family of games called chess. So you've got Shankei, which is Chinese chess, shogi, which is Japanese chess. There's apparently also Korean chess. There's a whole lot of them. But the current form of international chess emerged in Spain.
Okay.
It got popular in India. Shah went through Southern Europe, evolved into Chaturanga. So, I mean, chess.com has got millions of visitors every day. And it's still one of the most popular board games played to this day.
This is just a very sort of brief overview of some of the oldest games that we know about.
The mechanics are old.
Yeah. Those mechanics have come from a long way. So it's interesting to see that they're still being used. I mean, it's not like they're, well, at least the mechanics from chess that we know about. There's still a lot of that does find expression in modern games. There are so many ways of iterating on the same mechanic.
Exactly. Yes.
Just because the mechanic is really old doesn't mean that we're not going to see it in new games coming out. Having said that, people do seem to be coming up with a lot of mechanics as we basically as we go. So as you mentioned, Fayyaad, as technology changes, we also get different things become possible. Different mechanics become easier and more maybe accessible to players. Considering how many board games are produced every year, roughly how big a subject are we talking about when we're talking about board game mechanics? I mean, how many different mechanics are there?
It's going to depend a lot on how you define discrete mechanics.
Pedantry.
We're going to be talking about these sorts of, we're going to be discussing, and we do need to dip into pedantry every now and again.
Yeah, we're going to be pedantic, so you don't have to be.
Exactly. So our favorite point of reference, Board Game Geek, lists 191 separate mechanics. But then again, they also separate out a whole bunch of turn order mechanics into 8 separate entries. So the number can vary depending on who you're going to ask. Maybe we just always have had a lot of different ways of playing games and different ways of interacting with components and making a game. And it's just that the recent explosion in new games have just made these older mechanics more accessible and more available and more in the public eye.
How does knowing all of this jargon help us? How does it help us to know what a board game mechanic is and being able to distinguish between different mechanics?
Part of what humans love doing is naming things and putting things in categories and boxing things up and making things discrete. And having separate names for a way we move a particular pawn on a particular shaped board, it allows us to describe a game's moving parts in shorthand. It allows us to then create almost a scheme in our heads about how it works and then generalize it out to all sorts of other games, other effects in a shorthand without needing to go into an awful amount of detail about it. I write from a psychological perspective. Naming a mechanic enables players to shortcut the entire mental connection to the game systems and allows us to create a mental schema of what actions are needed to proceed through a game. So, for example, when I say a game is a deck builder or uses deck building mechanic, then players know that they'll be using a set of cards in a particular way. If I say it's an auction game, you know exactly what we're about to go into.
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely a part of that game that you then go, you don't necessarily need to explain what the mechanic is. what you need to explain to me maybe in this case is, how does the bidding work in this game? How does the deck building work in this game? Like what are the kind
Correct.
of, maybe
What are the differences?
what are the differences? What are the components? What's the aim? All the details about how that mechanic is implemented then becomes the focus of, say, a discussion about like, will I like this game?
Yeah, I mean, look, the kind of meta information that you'll get from a mechanic name, it's a lot more than you'd suspect on the surface of it. And you can get quite a good impression of how a game plays out rather than, reading the long-winded description on the back of the box.
More and more, the more games we've played, the more mechanics that I'm becoming familiar with, and the easier it is for me to start playing a game that uses a mechanic that I like. I've seen the mechanic, I haven't necessarily seen the game before.
Yeah.
So
you got to ask yourself, how useful is it to know, which mechanics you like?
Yes.
So when you're buying games, you must realize that because a game is a collection of mechanics, really at its heart.
Yeah.
It's just a small part of the equation. You do need to consider the other aspects of it, the theme, the components, how it plays, how many people it plays with.
Yeah.
Because quite often, the same mechanic used across different games can completely vary because
Yes.
implementation matters.
Yes, a lot actually. So I mean, there's definitely, I will definitely say that there's a mechanic is never enough for me to buy a game or to enjoy a game, regardless of how much I like the mechanic itself, especially because of how the same mechanic can vary across different games. Like we were saying, implementation matters a great deal. But if there's too much of a disconnect between different mechanics in the same game, I also sort of struggle. So it's part of an equation. It's not just the mechanics. Like you're never going to be able to look at a game and say, oh, this is a deck builder, I will obviously like it. Well, sometimes you'll like it, sometimes you'll hate it. Sometimes you'll think that this does deck building really well. This game doesn't really do deck building that well. Or you'll think, well, I like the deck building elements of this game, but everything else has turned me off. Yes, let's pause for a bit here and we'll be back after the break.
Hi, Fayyaad from Unshuffled. Thank you for downloading and listening to the show. We're a very new channel and we really appreciate your support. If you like what we do, please like and subscribe to hear about new episodes. If you'd like access to bonus features, reviews, discussions, affiliate links and more fun downloads, consider supporting us on Patreon or Ko-fi, if you're financially able. Otherwise, you can always help us get the word out about the show by leaving us a positive review on your favorite podcast app. And now, back to what we were talking about. Wait, what were we talking about? Welcome back, and let's continue with the podcast. So, Jacques, has knowing what mechanics in the game, for you personally, has knowing what mechanics coming up in the board game helped you understand what we're doing in the games we play on the Friday nights?
It really depends on the game. And it depends on how the game itself uses that mechanic. So some of the games, definitely the ones that are the more traditional ones that are that play more by the rules of, or the expectations of that particular mechanic, those are easy. Those definitely make it easier for you when you've played similar games before. Where it gets tricky for me is where the game is doing something quite different with that mechanic. And it tricks you into thinking that the game is going to play a certain way, and then you play according to certain expectations that you have, but that's your fault because, well, in this case, my fault. It's my own fault for having those. So how do I say this? Basically, before game night every week, we do send out links to how-to videos, and we've got access to the rules at all times, basically, when we're playing the game. Everybody's got the rules, everybody knows what those rules are, and you can go and look up what they are.
But just knowing what the rules are doesn't mean that you're going to know how to play it.
Yes, I mean, so what I would say is, like I said, okay, so it really depends on the game. It depends on how that particular game implements those mechanics and which mechanics it combines them with.
Yeah.
And, every game does it slightly differently. The ones that are more traditional, maybe more playing towards the expectations of that mechanism do make it easier for
Yeah.
a new person to learn them. A lot of the appeal of a game might be in how it upends your expectations.
Yeah.
There's a whole body of other similar things that do the same thing, or they've got enough in common with other games or whatever that do the same thing or have the same elements to them. I think definitely for me, what does help knowing a mechanic a great deal is to set my expectations. So when someone's explaining the rules for like a worker placement game, if you know that it's a worker placement game or that the worker placement mechanic is an important part of how this game plays, it makes it easier to understand how the rules work because
Yeah.
you can connect it to other games that use the same mechanic. You can, oh, it's like this other game we played maybe 3 weeks ago or a month ago, or oh, this is like this reminds me of my favorite game. My favorite game also has this particular mechanic. I mean, a lot of the time it does help. At that point, playing the game and playing different games actually becomes part of the learning experience, and that becomes part of the fun. So the like it kind of feeds into each other. I think it definitely does help. I also think it
Yeah.
does kind of help you to figure out which games you will definitely not be playing more than once. I mean, there have definitely been a couple of mechanics where I've gone like, that was
Not for
interesting. I'm
you.
not sure I'm going to put that at the top of my list anytime soon. I won't mention the one I'm specifically thinking about.
So I mean,
Yeah.
what for you makes a mechanic good for a game? I mean, when is something well designed versus something that doesn't really fit a game
Mm.
for you?
Okay, so I would say, I mean, obviously some mechanics are easier to learn. Some
Yeah.
mechanics kind of make the game a bit of a chore for me in terms of just cognitive overhead. Like
Yeah.
I've got to keep so many different things in my mind
It's the
at the
mental
same
equivalent
time.
of juggling.
Yeah, it's just it's. I think for me that's when I start having issues with games. Is like when there's maybe too many mechanics and they're kind of contesting each other in my brain, and I'm like, yeah, I can focus on one of you. But I think for me, and I think it does bear mentioning, even though it isn't exactly a board game mechanic, but complicated games or heavy games that combine lots of different mechanics that interact and interlock in interesting ways can be fun. But for me, that's often a harder sell than an easier game that has a fewer ones in them, just because I
Yeah,
find it
you.
easier to have fun.
But
When
I mean,
you're
look, some
yeah.
games might have insanely simple mechanics, but the gameplay might be
Mm,
horrendously complex. I mean, we look at the older games, chess and Go.
yeah,
I mean, the rule sets are very simple. They can be explained on a single page.
yeah,
But the fact that there are so many books written about strategies
mm,
in these games,
yeah,
it gives credence to their complexity.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a I think for me a balance that I mean I think yeah that's pretty much what I was my way of judging a game. There has to be a balance between the complexity of the mechanics and the actual play experience around a table. But some complicated games also make it easier for you to make sense of those mechanics than other games, and I think theme does help with that.
Yeah,
Um,
it does.
Sometimes, and I don't think we've got a specific jargon description for this, but UI, like the user experience, the user interface.
Yeah,
I think something like Horrified does this really, really well.
yeah,
Where like the way that the game is designed, it makes it easier because of how the components are designed. It makes it easier to remember what you're supposed to be doing and how things work and
yes.
what to do at any particular point. And I
The
think,
presentation does help.
yeah, I mean the presentation makes a big difference, and I think that for me is the almost like and it's part of where the balancing thing comes in. But for me,
Yeah,
that's part of what makes a mechanic work or not work in a particular game.
So
So
let's switch
yeah.
tack a bit.
Okay.
Let's talk about the way some games take an expectation of a mechanic
Mm.
and then they riff on that. They
Yeah.
switch something up. They change it around in an interesting new way, right? I know the term that they use in the industry is mechanic name with a twist.
Mm-hmm.
So you can it. I suppose that kind of signposts to players that you're going to be expecting something slightly different here. I
Mm.
don't know if I've seen a mechanic being described as with a twist, and then I haven't been slightly excited about it.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
like those interesting twists on mechanics. So
Yeah.
you can look at viticulture. I think was one of the good examples of this is worker placement with a twist.
Mm.
So I mean, it just changes the way that expectation that so you can know that
Mm.
your schema in your head of that mechanic can expect to be challenged in
Yeah.
in certain ways. So
Yeah.
you're subverting
Yes.
what's there.
Yeah, I definitely think that would definitely help. If especially if you really like a mechanic and you've collected a lot of games or you've played a lot of games using that mechanic, and you kind of going like,
Yeah,
okay, I'm like kind of getting like it's getting predictable. So that whole thing of
yeah,
like the whole promise of like we're going to put a twist on it, it becomes a part of like, ooh, and new
yeah, and it
what's
breeds an
going to happen? What are
excitement.
they doing? Must find out.
So I
Uh,
mean, do you feel sometimes that maybe there's I mean, you mentioned this a bit earlier that sometimes designers throw way too many mechanics into a game just for that cool factor.
Yes. I did. And I'm not the only person who thinks this. In fact,
Oh,
uh, in February 2023, one of our favorite board game designers, Eric Lang, tweeted something that he says was attacking all game designers. And I've I saved the tweet because I really like this. So your game is much harder to learn than you think. Your game relies too much on a litany of mechanical knowledge most people do not have. Teach your game to several smart non-gamers, not once, consistently. Reset your standards for easy to learn. So I think that encapsulates a lot of what a lot of my experience
that
with like heavier board games and even simpler board games where I'm like,
that is an important point to make.
yeah,
That is a very important point to make. That who the heavy gamers are not your forever audience. You do have to also look at
mm,
the other people who are newer to the hobby.
yeah.
I mean that brings to mind a fascinating example from a game called Neuroshima Hex,
Okay.
and with during playtesting, the playtesters were complaining and saying this faction is too overpowered or this faction is underpowered,
Mm.
and they went back to the designer and said to him, "This is the feedback from your playtesters." And he looked at the feedback and he basically said, "They don't know how to play. Tell them to play better." And it was only after several, really intense plays where they were going, "Oh, now we get it." But should you need to have that aha moment? I mean, look, I suppose some
Yeah.
people would live for that aha moment,
Yeah.
but you know,
Mm. So I think that at that point we have to acknowledge the fact that not all games are going to be for everybody. But
correct.
I do think that board game designers need to take this point to heart. Is the point of a board game is are the people around the table having fun? Now, if the expectation is that a game is going to be hard and it's going to be like a difficult game and it's going to have lots of moving parts, then fine, take that into consideration. But at the same time, you are kind of limiting yourself. You're limiting your game to something. And also a lot of games kind of feel like they're piling on mechanics because they need to have a list of 7 mechanics listed on the Board Game Geek site. Like,
and all the latest, coolest ones.
Yeah, like we have to have all these mechanics in it. And sometimes it's like, well, okay, did you think this through? Does each of these rules need to be here? Does it need to be so complicated? Does every mechanic you're using here need to have a twist?
No, true. I know some games address this by having a modular experience where you've got the base game that has, the simplest, easy to learn way of playing. And there's all these other extra bits and bobs in the box that you can start adding to it to add complexity to it. And for some players, they will never add that, and that's okay. And for other players, they will add that all from the very get-go, and they will never play without it.
Yeah.
And I mean, we'll touch on this sort of thing again when we talk about expansions.
Yes, and
but I think it's important to note that, maybe the base experience of a game shouldn't necessarily be the utmost hardest. But like we say, I mean, there are a range of audiences, and we've also mentioned now in our pilot episode that there are a lot of games coming out. You're not going to play them all, and they're not all for you.
Yeah, and that's fine.
They really are not all for you, and that's completely fine.
Yeah.
Not everyone loves chess.
Yes, and I think for me that was a big part of becoming more comfortable with mechanics and kind of going like, okay, so maybe I can acknowledge that this mechanic is really popular and really well implemented and everybody likes this, and I can go, I'm probably going to sit this one out.
Anyway, do you think we've covered enough on mechanics? Do you think our listeners will know by the end of this what we're talking about when we mean mechanics?
I think so. I think it's relatively safe to say that. And again, I mean, like I was saying at the beginning of the podcast, it's very hard to talk about board game mechanics without going into specific examples of board games and so on. But again, like I said, we will get to specific mechanics. Mechanics are such an integral part of not just what board games are, but the discussion about board games.
Yeah,
because absolutely. I mean, it's where everything begins and ends. So, like how the game is presented, what components are there, how players interact with each other, how they interact with the game. All that stuff builds up to being, what is this board game experience? And being able to talk about all of those different parts of that equation basically helps you become part of that conversation and the whole hobby and the experience, and like it will make it easier to play games and play a wider variety of games and find more games that you're going to enjoy playing. I think that's actually a pretty good place to end.
Thank you for listening. You can follow us on various platforms and join the conversation on Discord. Links in the episode description wherever you found this podcast. You can find articles and discussions about the terms used in this podcast over at nerdverse.co.za. You can also find articles on a host of other subjects, including tabletop role-playing games, interviews, events, and how-tos. Your hosts were Jacques van Heerden and Fayyaad Hendricks. Music, editing, producer, Fayyaad Hendricks. Executive producer, Jacques van Heerden. Unshuffled is a Nerdverse Productions podcast.